everyone, Stormy Strike here to talk about the diorama I made for the BreyerFest 2024 Pop Culture That Pops Diorama Contest. I'll be talking about my process for creating it, including how my ideas and plans for it have changed while working on it, and then I'll show off the finished product in detail in photos and video clips. Since I will be posting this video after Breyer announces the winners for the diorama contest during BreyerFest, I can also share that my diorama is one of the 20 that won. Even now, as of making this video, I can hardly believe it. I put a lot of work into this diorama and was of course making it with the hopes that maybe I could win, but I was also being careful not to get my hopes up too much because every year there are lots of amazing dioramas that get entered, and this year there were actually less winners than normal. Usually they have 7 winners per age category, but this year they only did 5 per age category for whatever reason. Therefore, I was even more shocked when I got an email from Breyer in the beginning of July about it. I actually screamed out loud when I saw the notification on my phone. The prize for the diorama contest this year, and has been since 2022 now, is a glossy celebration model. I really like the celebration model for this year, so I'm extra excited to get her. And you'll actually be able to see me unbox her in either part 1 or part 2 of my upcoming BreyerFest haul video. Now with that super exciting announcement covered, let me go in depth talking about my process of creating this diorama from start to finish. The theme and the rules for the diorama contest were announced in the beginning of February, I think. The theme was to depict one example of pop culture from any decade within the past 100 years. I immediately started brainstorming ideas, and I had a lot of ideas, especially with a theme that is as broad as this one. By the way, if my mom was still here, I'm sure she would have wanted to make her own diorama and enter it into this contest too, because she probably could have come up with a lot of ideas for the theme as well. I won't go over all the different ideas I came up with in the brainstorming process, in case I ever do decide to use them for future diorama contests, but I seriously wrote down 25 ideas on my initial brainstorming list, a lot of which were related to film, but I had others too that related to things like fashion, toys, and other entertainment. It was really difficult for me to decide on what idea to go with, so much so that it wasn't until 2 months later at the beginning of April that I narrowed down my ideas to a top 5 list. It was almost another month later until I decided that the pop culture topic I wanted to go with would be Lisa Frank. Some background information. Lisa Frank Inc. is a company that was founded in 1979 by Lisa Frank. The company began with producing only stickers at first, but then company success skyrocketed in 1987 with the expansion of various school supplies. Their popularity in sales peaked in the 1990s. I searched for like an hour, by the way, to find the exact date for when their sales peaked, but I could not find that information. A lot of kids growing up in the 80s or 90s may remember seeing colorful Lisa Frank designs on their folders or notebooks or other school supplies. I know I sure did. That was one of the factors that influenced my decision to pick Lisa Frank, is that it is something that I've seen and known about pretty much all my life. I've always loved the colorful animal designs. Another factor that led me to choose this specific topic was how to actually embody this idea with models and be able to fit it into the diorama size constraints. Some of my other ideas were ones that were going to be a little tricky with logistics on getting it to fit in the size and be able to do everything I wanted for it. So this idea seemed like something that wouldn't be overly challenging to accomplish. Now that I knew for sure which idea/pop culture movement I was going to go with, I needed to plan out my concept for the actual diorama. I started by looking at a bunch of Lisa Frank pictures to get an idea of the kinds of animals I wanted to include and the kind of scene I wanted to do. My original idea was to do a beach scene inspired by this picture specifically. On May 1st, I did a digital mock-up of my idea. My original plan was to use 2 Paddock Pal models and have a beach scene at the bottom and a cloud/space scene at the top. As the month went on, I made some mental adjustments to the scene and notes on how to accomplish it. Things like how I was going to make the palm trees and the water, and then also notes to add another horse or animal or two to the scene. But then June rolled around, and the time had come that I really needed to actually work on the diorama in order to finish it in time before the deadline. To note, I would have started working on the diorama a lot earlier if I could have, but things in my life just kept happening, and I just could not set aside the time to really work on it until about 3 weeks before the deadline. As I was starting on the actual diorama, or at least a little bit, I was realizing that I needed to change the concept. What I had in mind was just not going to work out visually, nor in regards to the time and supplies I currently had available. I needed to change it up, so I did a new mock-up of the idea. This time, there would be no beach scene. Instead, it would be a cloud lake surrounded by space. I would use different sized models, including one is a leopard and a tiger, in addition to the Pegasus and unicorn that were already planned. This exact layout would change a few times when I was actually working on the diorama, but now I had a more solid and manageable concept in place. Now I could move on to really working on the diorama. I did not take any video clips of me working on the diorama, but I did try and remember to take progress pictures every so often to show how I made it and how my ideas evolved and adapted to the challenges I encountered while working on it. The first thing I worked on was cutting out foam board to make the structure of the diorama. I taped it together with masking tape and measured it to make sure it wasn't too big. I did not want to glue any of it yet though, because I would have to paint on the inside of it, and I figured painting it would be kind of difficult if it was already glued together as a box like this. For the water in the diorama, originally for the beach scene I was planning on using like clear resin, but I didn't have any of that on hand and didn't want to commit to buying any of it, so then my idea evolved to using a mirror. But I didn't have any spare mirrors on hand that would work, and I also had trouble finding a good one to order. So instead, I decided to use glass. We have a lot of glass at my house already, so I didn't need to buy anything for it, and I think it actually gave a better effect than the idea of a mirror in the end anyway. I cut down the glass so it would fit inside the diorama, but I did actually end up having to cut it down even more later on into working on the diorama, but I don't have a picture of that. At this point, I decided to take all my supplies to my fiance's parents' house and work on the diorama for about a week there, because there's a lot more room in their house, and I was able to actually spread everything out for the diorama out on one big long table, and so it was nice not having to constantly shuffle things around or put stuff away and things like that like I would have had to do at home. Something I knew that was going to take a while was customizing the models for the diorama, especially since I was planning to do some sculpting on them. So I knew that was something I needed to kind of prioritize to do first. So I picked out which models I was going to use from a bunch of stablemate bodies. The Paddock Pal Unicorn was one that I had always planned on using, so that one was good to go. My initial plan was, this image here. My idea was to use a mini Winnie for the Pegasus, a stablemate giraffe for the tiger, a stablemate foal for a tiger cub, and a stablemate's pony as a leopard cub. But you will see now and later that this does change a little bit. I started prepping the models for sculpting by cutting off the unicorn's beard and trimming down the giraffe's tail. And then it was at this point that I realized that the foal I had originally picked out had a fracture in its leg, and I didn't feel like trying to fix that right then, so I just grabbed a different full body instead. I feel like this one actually complements the other one better anyway though. So on this foal, I also trimmed down the sides and the end of the tail and roughened it up a bit. This was all using a Dremel tool, by the way. I then began creating the tiger tails on the giraffe mare and the foal. I did this by sketching out the shape of the tail on paper and then shaping aluminum foil into the shape that I wanted. I glued the foil to the model's tail by using super glue and baking soda. It's hard to tell on this picture, but for the giraffe mare, I did the same thing, except I also wrapped some wire around her tail to make it more rigid and to further help the clay stick to it. I was also planning to sculpt dolphins, and one of them was going to be larger, so I decided to make the base for that one out of aluminum foil as well. So with all the aluminum foil armature stuff kind of in place, I then began sculpting the tails on the soon-to-be stablemate tiger horses. I also added a braid for the unicorn and kind of smoothed out the little rough patch under its chin. And then I also sculpted the dolphins. For the smaller two, I did just kind of take a piece of clay and mush it around until I got some dolphin shapes out of it. For this, I used blue Aves Epoxy Sculpt. I made sure to do all the sculpting in one day because I really wanted to make sure I had enough time to let it dry for 24 hours before going on to the next step. The next step being prepping them with a bit of sanding and then spraying them with a few coats of white primer. It was then on to actually painting them, and it was at this point that I was regretting not doing either more coats of primer on them or getting some white spray paint to use as a base coat or something, because two of these models are primarily white, which means I had a lot of layers of thin white paint to put on them to build up a nice base coat. Because that was taking a long time and having to wait for layers of paint to dry, I started to work on the rest of the diorama. You can't really see it well in these pictures, but I had sketched out the plans for the sky in pencil onto the foam boards. These would kind of show where the rainbow and planets would go. And then I had started painting the lighter colors of the sky on there, with the plan of having it kind of look like a sunset fading into the night sky. I did this by just using a little watered down acrylic paint and building up layers of color, overlapping each other, and then sometimes also mixing both colors together on the board while they were still wet. Back to the models, after the white base coats were done, I used a couple layers of gray pastel to give them just a little bit of shading so they wouldn't be a totally flat white. I sealed them with the matte spray between and after the layers were done. It was then on to the colorful painting. Painting the foal and pony with these bright, colorful base coats was a lot of fun. I did reference a lot of the pictures of the Lisa Frank characters they are inspired by to make sure I got the kind of right look. For the giraffe and the unicorn, I began painting on their markings, which are individual spots and stripes of color on top of that white shaded base coat. I realize I probably didn't mention, but I've been using acrylic paint for all of this as well. It was at some point around this time that I think I ended up going to the craft store the following day because I did not have some of the colors of paint that I needed, and I also needed something for the rainbow, which I will go ahead and talk a bit about now, even though I don't have too many pictures to show of it. So my original idea was that the rainbow was going to come out and be this 3D rainbow and be either made of clay or tubing, something like that. I was running into some issues though with how I was going to execute that, especially in regards to painting it and making sure it didn't end up being too big or too small. So I began looking for alternate solutions, which I found through brightly colored pipe cleaners I found at Michael's. They ended up being just what I needed, and you'll see more of that in a little while. Now that I had all the paints I needed, I returned to painting the models. I added more stripes on the tiger, which each stripe took at least 2 or 3 layers of paint to build up in order to look good, by the way. And I was also adding color to the unicorn, including spots on the body, rainbow feathering, rainbow hooves, rainbow horn, and rainbow hair. The tiger foal was getting some black stripes painted on it, as well as its green eyes. For the diorama poster board things here, I painted black for the night sky, and later, once that was all dried, I watered down white paint and splattered a bunch of stars onto it, which was really fun. Splattering paint for things like stars or flea bites on a model is always super fun to me. It is such a simple but effective trick. Back to yet more painting on the models. These models took me a lot longer to paint than I was anticipating, by the way. Part of it might have just been my perfectionism, but they were also taking just many hours to work on. I continued to add color that was needed on the unicorn. In this picture, you can see that the hooves are looking a little bit more rainbow, but they still needed more layers. The rainbow braid was coming along. You also see that the mane was getting more rainbow strands of color, but that didn't last, and I'll get more into that in a bit. I finished adding black stripes to the tiger foal and black spots to the leopard pony, as well as their other little details like their eyes and their noses. I'm sorry I don't have more progress pictures of them. At this point, they were pretty much done and just needed their finishing touches. For the rest of the diorama, I started to work on the rainbows for the background. I originally planned to just paint the rainbows directly onto the foam boards, along with the rest of the sky, but I was concerned about how that would look with layering the paint colors, because I did have some like black and darker colored paint that were in the area of the rainbow, and because I was using neon colors that weren't very opaque, I was worried that just was not going to work out well. So my solution was to paint them on white paper instead. I sketched them out on the paper and then painted them with many coats of paint. At that time, I also painted the little planets, and then after all that was dry, I cut everything out. And at this point, I did forget to take any progress pictures for quite a while. So, ta-da! I was now finished with painting the models. The tiger horse got all her rainbow stripes and details painted on. And then the unicorn, we have to talk about the unicorn. With the unicorn, I originally wanted to do the hair like this Lisa Frank rainbow unicorn, where each lock of hair is a specific color, which I think looks really fun and cool in this picture, but in trying to paint it, I found it to be very time consuming. It's also just not really working out the way I had hoped because this unicorn's mane and tail are sculpted to be very curly. Most of the manes and tails of other Breyer models are just straight or wavy, and I think maybe painting those would have been a lot easier. But because of this curly hair, I was finding that trying to do all these rainbow strands was not only challenging, but it felt like it was making the overall design look way too busy. In a similar fashion, I was trying to paint the rainbow unicorn horn to look like the character it was inspired by, but that was also just starting to become a challenge with the time crunch I had. And again, I was worried maybe that it was making the unicorn's overall design just look too busy to the eye. So the solutions I ended up going with, as you'll see here, was to just make the mane and tail a nice rainbow gradient. And for the horn, I decided to paint a solid silver. Although in hindsight, I don't know why I just didn't try to paint the horn like a rainbow gradient like the mane and tail. I probably should have done that, but oh well, it still looks fine. I feel like these were better choices than what I was originally going with. And maybe if I had no deadline on this model, I could have put more time into trying to make the complicated rainbow hair and horn work. But I just really couldn't risk spending too much time trying to do that and then it to end up not looking good at all and having to completely repaint it anyway. So I feel like this way of doing it still turned out pretty nice. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I also decided to add a little black into the braid to define it a little more. It just felt a little off before in that it kind of needed something, so thought putting black paint in the crevices might make it stand out more. I had finished the unicorn spots and added details to the face. I don't have pictures of it, I'm afraid, but the muzzle is another thing that I decided to change. I originally was keeping it white and then had the little colorful spots to it, like in this picture of the Lisa Frank character. But it was just not translating well onto the model at all. It made it look like the model was sick or something. I don't know, but it just didn't look great, so I gave the model a gray muzzle instead and kept the little colorful spots around its eyes. You will see that there is this mini Winnie that I was planning to use for the Pegasus. I didn't actually fully repaint it though, I just quickly painted on some pink to the mane and tail. Now that all the other models were done being painted, I sprayed them with Krylon clear satin spray. I will often use satin spray instead of matte spray for decorator models because I feel like it really makes their colors pop more. I also glossed all the models' eyes using Liquitex gloss varnish. And I also put a little bit of gloss on the unicorn's horn. With the models done, I could focus mainly on the rest of the diorama. I glued down the paper rainbows onto the boards, and I played around with the general layout of the diorama. While my original concept had been that this lake and clouds were at the bottom, and the unicorn would be running down the side at an angle, while actually working on the diorama, I had realized that this was just not a nice composition because it would mean the unicorn would hide pretty much anything to the right side of the diorama. So instead, I raised the lake up and lowered the rainbow in the unicorn. I used a piece of foam board for the rainbow, which I partially cut sections into it to allow it to bend on one end. Then to raise the cloud lake area up, I hot glued together 4 pieces of poster board, and I had measured it and such so that the sheet of glass would comfortably rest on it. And I cut out another piece of foam board to go on top. This piece I actually sketched out the shape of the lake and cut it out. I hot glued more pieces of foam board onto this base for the clouds around the lake to build it up into some interesting shapes. I realized having it flat would not only make the overall look of the diorama less interesting, but the clouds themselves are supposed to have varying shapes, so it kind of only made sense to give this a little bit more dimension. This was actually really fun to cut out these pieces of foam and glue them around and build up this area. I also started adding the clouds onto it, And the clouds are just cotton balls that I had stretched apart and then glued onto the foam board pieces using a combination of white glue and hot glue. Adding the clouds were another part of making this that I thought was just super fun. I also built up the back and the clouds so that the back corners of this piece would come up and kind of cover the seams of the rainbow and possibly any imperfections in the areas where the boards would eventually glue together. Using hot glue, I glued down the pipe cleaners onto the little board for the rainbow. Something else I started doing was adding lights to the back of the board for the stars. I did this by poking holes into the boards with push pins and then taping fairy lights behind the little holes to create these little pinpoints of light. I started off with just one side of the board to make sure it would look good, as the rest needed to wait until after I glued down the other sides of the board together. And I think at this point I did have some of the boards glued down, which again I used hot glue for. Also, word of caution, because I didn't mention it yet, having painted these pieces of foam board did make the boards warp, and I tried to flatten them as much as I could before gluing them together, but there was kind of only so much I could do with the time I had. That was something I had not foreseen, that these boards were going to warp after I painted them. I finished off the pipe cleaner rainbow and got it into position. In this photo you can also kind of see where I hid the battery pack for the lights, which is behind the rainbow between the base of the cloud lake and the wall of the foam board. I continued adding more cotton ball clouds to cover the base of the lake, and then lastly used them to cover the edge of the rainbow and the little spot underneath the rainbow where the wire for the lights is running. I laid everything out in the diorama to see if I wanted to still use the dolphins, because that's right, I did still have the dolphins that I had sculpted. But I hadn't painted them yet because I wasn't entirely sure if I was going to use them or not, and I didn't want to waste time painting them if I didn't actually end up using them. By the way, at this point it was Wednesday night, and the diorama was due the upcoming Friday morning. I had left my fiance's that night to finish the last of the diorama at home, and this is where the work in progress photos pretty much end, because I was on a serious crunch time at that point to get the diorama done, and I just did not take any time to stop and take pictures. I can still tell you what I did though, and have photos of the completed pieces so you still can see what I'm talking about. So I did end up painting the dolphins that morning. I used all the ones I had sculpted except for the tail piece, because I had decided at that point I was just not going to do a underwater effect thing, and the tail was having a hard time standing up on its own, so it wasn't worth trying to incorporate into the diorama and probably fall over all the time. I also finished a Lisa Philly logo that I made on paper with colored pencils and markers. I'd actually started that the day before, but finished it up on Thursday. I also made Pegasus wings out of paper using mostly markers. At this point, I was still planning on using the little Mini Winnie model that I had semi-painted, but it was just not looking right when I put it in the diorama. It just didn't really feel like it fit with the forced perspective of everything else. And just in general, I just thought it wasn't looking that great, which was unfortunate because I was really wanting to use a Mini Winnie for this. I didn't want to completely scrap the idea of having a Pegasus in there though, so instead I sketched out a little paper horse, cut it out, and then glued the wings to it and glued it all onto the diorama. It was at this time that I also decided where I wanted to put the planets and such, and I glued those down along with the Lisa Philly logo. When the paint for the dolphins had dried, I just slapped on a thick layer of gloss varnish on them, and I think if I had more time I probably would have done a few more layers of gloss on them, but again, was kind of rushing at this point. But once they were dried, I placed them where I wanted to on the diorama, and then I took some white acrylic paint and painted on some ripples on the glass to make it look a little bit more like water. At some point, I also added the top board piece, which I taped to the top instead of gluing like the rest, which was very good foresight on my part, as you'll soon learn. At the time, I thought it just might be good to have it somewhat easy to remove in case I needed to adjust stuff inside the diorama later or something. But anyway, I'd got that part taped on, and then I put stars in the top. I cut down the sheet of sparkly blue paper that would go under the glass for the water. And then, it was at this point I thought the diorama was done. So I go and take pictures of it, lots and lots of pictures, but something wasn't sitting right with me on how it looked. It looked too dark in some spots, and the water especially just didn't look pretty like it did before. I had tested out how it would look under the glass and it looked beautiful, and so I couldn't understand why it wasn't looking good. So I went ahead and tried the other piece of paper I had that was not glitter and just like a soft blue. I put that under there and thought maybe that was the solution, but that wasn't looking great either. That's when I realized that I needed to take the top off the diorama. Again, fortunately, I had the foresight to only tape it on, so removing it wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been. I really don't want to think what it might have happened if I had glued it on, but that also meant I had to take off all the lights that were taped to it. And now that this was done, it had created a couple problems I need to fix. One was that I really had to paint the edges of the diorama now because the ones at the top were very stark and did not look good because they were no longer being covered up. And two, I had to figure out what to do with the extra lights, which I could have done nothing with or just added more stars in the other sides of the diorama. But I returned to a brief idea I had before. Even though I thought I hadn't really prepared enough to make this work super well, the idea was to add lights into the clouds. I think if I had planned for this earlier, I probably could have arranged them in a better way and made them seem even cooler, but it was still a very cool effect to add. So once I kind of got that figured out and I reset up everything, it was then that I actually was definitely done with the diorama. I was not done with my entry at this point though. I still had to retake all of the pictures again, this time of the new and improved version of the diorama. And then that night I had to pick out all the best pictures to send in, and I had to write up my description, which involved a little bit of research to make sure I got all the information about Lisa Frank correct. And then I quadruple checked that all my information was correct before at last sending off my email Friday morning about 5 hours before the deadline. At last, it was finally done, and at this point I was honestly a little sick of it, so I kind of took a break from even attempting to make this video and such on it until I had some time away from it. Making this diorama had its ups and downs. There were moments I almost felt like giving up because I thought I had taken on more than I could handle, and then there were also moments where I was very happy and excited with what I was creating. This was the first time in a while that I've set aside so much continuous time to work on an art project, especially something this big and intricate with various parts going on. In the end, I am really happy and proud of what I accomplished here. I hope anyone watching this, or anyone that sees the pictures of it on my social media or the BreyerFest site, gets some enjoyment from seeing it too. Out of curiosity, let me know which model in this diorama is your favorite. Is it the Paddock Pal Unicorn, the Tiger Cub Foal, the Rainbow Tiger Draft Mare, the Leopard Pony, or maybe the Dolphins? Let me know in the comments. The rest of this video is going to be any detailed shots of the diorama and its models that just haven't been shown on screen yet, so you can relax and enjoy those. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more Model Horse content. I hope you have an awesome day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye everyone!